Welcome to our Research at City podcast. I'm Rob Rowe, the current acting global head of research. And with me on the podcast today is Tony Yuen. 2 years ago, we thought that the power grid or the grid itself was under enormous strain because of rising demand and supply, both on the data center side and renewable side. How has that situation changed since then? Now we have even more demand due to data centers. We have even
Yeah.
more renewables. We have EVs.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So the power grid certainly is really important because our lives really right now revolve around electricity. But then the power supply side tend to come from places that are really far away. And that's why the power grid is enormous but it's also aging and it needs upgrades. But at the same time, power demand, as you talked about, the data center side have been rising very quickly. Over the last, couple of years, the estimates for data center power demand just gone up even more because there are even more use cases and then more greater expansion. But then there's also the broader just greater electrification narrative and mega trend going forward as well, which also need the grid to expand. So it's not just, within the US, but also globally, because this issue is actually exacerbated by what happened in the conflict in the Middle East, because some of the countries right now are rethinking the whole notion of energy security. And these countries are really think about energy source that are for power generation that want to be domestic. And also you can see the EV sales, electric vehicle sales have gone up as well because they also want fuel that power these vehicles that would be domestic, right? But all these require more power grid and all that. And the challenge is large and is real. So the IEA just published a report earlier this year, basically sum it up really nicely. It says that roughly about 2,500 gigawatts of renewables, storage, and large demand projects, such as data centers, are stalled because of the grid problem.
Mm.
So, to give a sense of scale, a city with 1 million people generally uses 1 to 2 gigawatts of power. We're talking about 2,500 gigawatts of renewable storage and large demand projects like data centers are stalled. So what that means is that we are talking about this being the grid as good as it is over the last basically 100 years in providing electricity to us, it's now still a major issue at this point.
And beyond those power supply challenges, what are other constraints do you think you would anticipate facing?
Yeah. So, I think what happens is that right now, given that expanding, improving the grid proved to be, rather difficult because of regulatory and labor constraints and others. So that's why, on the one hand, there's a lot of, demand for, electrical equipment to just to improve the grid, right, to the extent possible. But then also bring forward the use of more on-site generation as well. But then if you just step back, why is it so difficult to expand the grid? Well, if you look at the regulatory kind of, framework, because it is basically necessary because you want to take care of the stakeholders, the people who are living there, and then, environmental issues, you certainly don't want a power line right behind, in your backyard, right? Hence the NIMBY part. But this is real, right? And then also the other side is that, for example, in the US, the labor issue is really big. So the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, out of the Department of Labor. So essentially, is saying that there are shortage of labor, professional trade labor, by roughly about 220,000 workers in critical industries like construction, HVAC, electrical, and many of them basically you require them to build data centers, but also required by utilities, renewables, EV charging. So there's a lot of overlap. But then these skilled tradespeople, they don't suddenly come out and you can call upon them and you cannot train them, and then get them ready within a month or whatnot. And basically, BLS expect that to be a shortage well in the 2030s, right? And so then not only is the labor being, a obstacle at this point to further expanding a lot of the grid part, whatnot, but also regulatory, which we talked about. But then something interesting about the kind of demand that data center draw from in terms of electricity. Because it's not just that the demand for electricity is big, it's just that they're highly volatile. So let's say a training model suddenly need to ramp up. There's actually demand a lot more electricity, and then they can ramp up and down very quickly, big swings. It's almost like the demand side of renewables. Because if you think about wind generation, solar generation, If there's no wind and the cloud, then basically generation just come off. And so what that means, the grid also need to accommodate that, not just volume aspect, but also volatility of these power generation. So that means that the situation become much more complicated than just a
Mm,
delivering power.
that's interesting. And so, given the rapid growth of data centers, and I guess we would say demand, what's the current landscape then for critical power equipment, and what's your outlook for its evolution in 2030?
Sure, yeah. So there's actually definitely significant opportunities, right? So if you look at US data center electrical equipment market alone, is projected to grow from roughly about 20 billion in 2025 to roughly about $65 billion by 2030. And then taking a more broad scope, the global transformer market will likely expand from roughly about $60 billion in 2024 to $93 billion by 2030, somewhere around there. This surge in kind of demand for these electrical equipment fueled by data centers, utilities, renewables, really put a big strain on the infrastructure and the manufacturing. So that's why you have a lot of bottlenecks within the components of throughout the grid. So the grid is not just power lines, right? In fact, there's a lot of overlap in terms of what the data center want in terms of power equipment as well as the renewable side. So definitely there's a lot of demand for large power transformers, a lot of generated step-up transformers, high voltage switch gear, medium voltage switch gear. And so that's why recently our colleague talked about solid state transformer as well being something, new as well, and then so on and so forth. There's actually a lot of overlap, and that's why the market is getting quite big. But also because of such strong demand, the wait time for these equipment basically ranges from something like 18 months to 4 years. And that's why some of the kind of developers of data centers or renewables, basically, particularly data centers, moving towards sort of more self-generation. And that's why the situation on the grid have been evolving into kind of a different kind of landscape.
That brings up another development as well, because you still have this enormous demand, but the supply will be coming on slowly as a result of these items you're mentioning. But you have a phrase called BYOG, which I think is hilarious. It's great. Bring your own generation. This is
Yes.
obviously a manifestation of what's going on. How do you, how do you see that connecting to the grid is a huge hurdle, right? Because of infrastructure and transformer limitations. But what's the most realistic solution for data centers right now? Especially
Sure,
when you think about, BYOG.
yeah. Not bring your own gin, but definitely bring your own generation.
For your own generation, right?
That's right. I think definitely we can look at what the hyperscalers have done, right? Because as example, to see the evolution and how they see this market to get the power to the data centers. So initially, if you look at before, you can see that they want to co-locate the data center at existing power plants, right? So there were some deals between hyperscalers and the utilities, right? And that's why some of the revival of nuclear power plants. But there are very few of them. And so basically they are done with that co-location with some of the existing power plants. And then, of course, there's co-investment with PPA, which is power purchase agreement, typically renewables. But then one thing about renewables is that typically you need a big land mass, your footprint. And so your data center either is literally where the renewable sort of solar farm, wind farm would be, or you have to be far away. That means that you need a grid. And given that we just talk about, expanding the grid is kind of, not easy. And that's why the solution is bring your own generation. Literally,
Mhm.
you build a data center and have the generation right next to it so that you can serve power. And that generation can become bigger and bigger. And some of the solutions that people are using more and more would be kind of natural gas turbines, the combined cycle or single cycle, which is the typical power plants that we use. And there's something called the reciprocating engine or recip engine. There's the four-stroke engine as well. There is the aeroderivative turbine, which is basically jet and converted using jet fuel into natural gas. There's solid oxide fuel cells, also uses natural gas, diesel backup, and all that, right? Plus, of course, you still have renewables and batteries. And so, because they couldn't really solve the grid problem very quickly, and that's why they moved towards self generation. But this
Mm.
actually give us an example of show us a deeper structural element involved. Because if you look at the power grid, why do we have a big power grid? Is that historically, the long-standing key advantages of the current centralized power system what the typical, how they call it in the industry is called a bulk power system, BPS, with large transmission network is that power generation is supposed to be more cost efficient when you have big power plants. But big power plants tend to be located far away from demand centers. So that means that you need a grid to do that, right? But if the grid now becomes a bottleneck, and if distributed generation that we are seeing in terms of these BYOG, bring on generation with the gas turbines, recip engine, fuel cells, whatnot, or just distributed generation even for consumers with the solar plus battery combo, then that means that you also have some sort of evolution. I won't say revolution, but evolution within the power grid where it might actually moving back to a state where generation will happen where demand is to get around the grid issue because of the either approval process, labor issue, and other myriads of kind of hurdles that are preventing supply of power meeting demand of power.
Tony, on that, how are the regulators looking at independent companies creating their own generation versus what's maybe on the power grid? Is there a demand that those generators be included in the overall power grid, or is it perfectly okay for a hyperscaler to create its own generation?
This is a great question because it really depends on the different kind of jurisdictions or power markets,
Mhm.
right? But also, if you're thinking about some of the on the developer side, as much as they want to be what we call behind the meter, which is the generation will be behind your kind of data center or whatnot, basically also want to connect to the grid just in case that if they want electricity from
Mhm.
the grid, then they can draw from the grid as well. And then for the grid or the different power market themselves as well, because one will have to think about if you introduce different generation, how would that be, would let's say affect the community? And would that generation be taken away from power supply to other consumers, or basically you want that to be available for other consumers as well. So that's why there are different rules for different power markets, and that's why, for example, in the U.S. PJM have to revise a lot of their rules as well, and
Mm.
MISO, which is Midwest Independent System Operator, ERCOT, which is basically the independent system operator for much of Texas, the different rules. So that's why it also makes it complicated because of different regulators or self kind of regulating organization different rules for how they integrate these generation.
Mm. And you mentioned natural gas turbines and engines, maybe a top choice for BOAOG. Could you talk about that a little more, expand on it? Why are they so
Mhm.
popular?
Yep, that's right. Part of it is that the natural gas turbines and engines are popular because they have strong reliability. Because as long as you have a natural gas grid, you have the fuel source, and then you have the generation right there. That these turbines or engines have been in existence for a long time, so you know that
Mm.
they can generate. They can also ramp up very quickly because typically not only in terms of provide general supply, but also short-term boost in supply as well. Unlike, let's say, certainly building a coal plant would be difficult. And of course, nuclear, that definitely some of the thinking build nuclear, but then building actual nuclear power plants seems to be take a long way, right? But then these engine or turbines can be small, can be modular, and you can combine them as well as you expand your center campus. So that means that you can scale, you can bring them on easier, but that also disadvantage makes them highly popular. And so there's a lot of orders for these kind of generators and engines, basically using natural gas. So there's also a backlog of these turbines and engines. So much so that essentially the gas turbine orders, for example, they typically average 42 gigawatts annually to roughly about 100 gigawatts in 2025 alone. So
Mm.
there's definitely big growth in that area.
Do you anticipate, Tony, that the growth in AI will necessarily slow down as a result of this, or do you think it's already happening?
I think that the slowdown is actually potentially more short term because you have seen
Mhm.
that there are, data centers either get pushed back, delayed, or canceled, right? But
Mhm.
then these equipment, the power equipment, infrastructure equipment, as well as generation equipment, are based on order And a lot of them will start coming in basically by 2028, 29, 2030, right? So that means that
Hmm.
you can see more of the expansion of these data centers as the equipment arrive, and therefore a data center, what we call the power shell, would be energized. So they will have electricity to actually power these chips. And then there's also the other thing is how data centers themselves are using software techniques, right? Either pruning or become more efficient, or basically to some of the hyperscalers, basically they shift loads around. So basically they might be processing something in one data center, but they have data center, maybe you need more power from other data centers, there may be power shortage, then you shift the load calculation to another data centers, right? So definitely there
Hmm.
are hardware solutions that are coming as well as software
Hmm.
solutions.
Hmm. And looking at the overall global landscape, are all regions sort of sharing a similar strategy on AI-driven power markets, and where there are distinct approaches and challenges emerging worldwide? I'm thinking mostly about the US, Europe, and China.
Yeah, absolutely. So the US definitely is mostly driven power demand growth from data center demand, right? And given that US has a big natural gas pipeline grid, as well as abundant resource and low natural gas prices. And that's
Mm.
why if you look at our generation, bring your own generation, BYOG, is really, focused on natural gas. But then in Europe is that they have a kind of structurally, somewhat distinct from the US
Mhm.
because there's a strong commitment to decarbonization, limited fossil fuels, and then a system that is more anchored around renewable generation. So what that means that tend to generate higher electricity costs, and also they have, if you were kind of the data center development. So what that means is that they're still able to draw on their the power grid, but more so they develop more of the renewable side. And then China
Mm.
is actually a quite interesting story. They have lots of resources, but they're also expanding. And so then that's why some of experts on the tech side basically saying that, US is power constrained, but China's chip constrained, but not power constrained. But China
Mm.
definitely is building a lot of, transmission lines. They're big in power infrastructure equipment, the transformers, whatnot. They're really expanding the grid. And that's why you can see that they have building certainly data center at different locations facing less of a problem on the grid side and therefore less of a bring your own generation impact, but they are able to at least expand on the transmission as well as distribution side of the power system.
Excellent. Well, Tony, this is fascinating topic. We go on all day, but we'll be watching this closely. Thank you so much for your insights. And thanks all of our listeners for attending our podcast. This was recorded on June 18th, 2026.
This podcast contains thematic content and is not intended to be investment research, nor does it constitute financial, economic, legal, tax, or accounting advice. This podcast is provided for information purposes only and does not constitute an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instruments. The contents of this podcast are not based on your individual circumstances and should not be relied upon as an assessment of suitability for you of a particular product, security, or transaction. The information in this podcast is based on generally available information, and although obtained from sources believed by Citi to be reliable, its accuracy and completeness are not guaranteed. Past performance is not a guarantee or indication of future results. This podcast may not be copied or distributed, in whole or in part, without the express written consent of Citi. Copyrights 2025 Citigroup Global Markets, Inc.